This is a Chinese cleaver and this is a meat cleaver. Now, although these two knives look very similar, they were designed to be used in completely different ways. If you were to use this Chinese cleaver like this meat cleaver, then you would probably dull, crack, and chip your blade during its first use. And if you were to use this meat cleaver like you would this Chinese chef's knife, you wouldn't even be able to slice a tomato. What's up, y'all? I'm Chef Brandon with Cutlery and More, and in this video, I'm going to share with you the unique characteristics of a Chinese cleaver versus a meat cleaver. Then I'm going to show you how a Chinese cleaver is great for tap chopping, push chopping, and rock chopping, as well as mincing, slicing, crushing, and scooping. And then we're gonna put the meat cleaver to work here, hacking through some chicken thigh bones and pounding its thick spine with a mallet to turn some St. Louis style ribs into bite-sized riblets. Okay, before we dive in, I want to explain that there are a few names to these knives that can be a bit confusing, especially if you're shopping for knives online and you can't pick them up and hold them in order to see and feel their differences. These knives here, 1, 2, 3, 4, are called Chinese cleavers, but they're also called or referred to as Chinese chef's knives or vegetable cleavers. The Japanese version of the Chinese cleaver is called a Chuka Bocho, which translates to Chinese kitchen knife, which also is sometimes called a Japanese cleaver. Meanwhile, these are meat cleavers or just a cleaver. Now, what's confusing is that if you were to search online for a cleaver, you'll be shown Chinese cleavers. And if you were to search for a Chinese cleaver, you'll also be shown meat cleavers. Now, whether that's a little confusing to you or not, the good thing is that by the end of this video, you're going to understand the key features of these very different knives so that you don't end up ordering a meat cleaver when you were really wanting something to do veg prep with and slice boneless meats. Okay, let's talk about the Chinese cleaver. A Chinese cleaver is basically an all-purpose knife that is easily recognized by its very tall blade with a rectangular shape that has a curve right at the tip here and sometimes a curve at the heel. The blade length of a Chinese cleaver is usually between 6 to 8 inches long, and it's really known for its iconic barrel-shaped rounded handle. Now, as you can see with the 4 different knives here, they're going to vary in their size, their shape, their height, the type of steel, the finish, and as well as the handle, going from the more traditional Chinese cleaver to the Western style German handle. These Chinese cleavers were designed for precision and versatility, making them ideal for slicing, tap and push chopping, your rock chop or your cross chop / mincing, which makes them ideal for prepping a variety of ingredients, including meat, fish, fruits, vegetables, and even dough for noodles. Basically, nearly everything that a German style chef's knife or Western chef's knife or a Japanese gyuto can do, a Chinese cleaver can also do. Okay, let's get these Chinese cleavers in action so you can see how versatile they actually are. The first knife I have here is a Sentan. Now, this is hand forged in China with high carbon Japanese steel that is clad with stainless steel, making it really easy to maintain. The first knife technique that I'm going to do for you is the tap chop, which is where you are going in a more up and down motion on your cutting board, which is ideal for, say, doing an onion julienne. Now, from here, quick little onion tip. Instead of trying to chop away at this really high piece of product, all you have to do is plop it down. Now you have a lower area, which is safer for your hands, and continue your julienne. Something great about the Chinese cleaver is that it has a very straight spine as well as a straight tip. So it's really nice to move product around on your cutting board rather than going like this and dulling the edge. Let's do the other half here with the Wusthof Chinese cleaver. A couple differences between the two here. You can see that the Wusthof right here is much thicker in the spine. It also is a full tang handle, which means that the blade, the metal goes all the way down into the butt of the knife, and then the handle is secured on each side. Compared to this Sentan, you can see that this has a much thinner spine, and you can see at the very base where the tang ends, but this is a much thinner tang, so the weight distribution between these two, this is going to be a little bit more blade heavy, and you would think this would be blade heavy, but because of that full tang, it balances out the weight a little bit. Regardless, any of these cleavers are going to be blade heavy, so if you're looking to have a grip that's better balanced, then all you have to do is choke up with your pinch. So it's a huge difference in the feel between these two knives. This Wusthof, because of that thicker spine, might be better for a smaller product to do tap chopping with, but would be great for push chopping, mincing, rock chopping, the various types of things. But when it comes to pulling it up off the cutting board higher, like you have to with that onion, this Sentan is a bit lighter, and the blade being a little bit thinner glides through the product even easier. There's a lot of nuance to knives based off of the finish, as well as just millimeters worth of thickness that can make a lot of difference in what type of knife cuts are best for each knife. Now, in addition to using the spine or the tip to be able to move product around, the other thing that's great about cleavers is that you can put the knife down on its side and scoop product up on top of it to move into your mise en place containers, into the bowl where you're mixing your recipe, or right into your pan to start cooking. Hey, down here. When it comes to Japanese knives or knives that are not completely stainless steel, you definitely need to maintain them a bit differently than, say, this Wusthof here. Yes, this does have stainless steel in it, but it's stainless, and just the design and the high carbon of this blade here, in between uses, definitely when you're done using it, but even in between, if you're gonna set it down for a while, rinse it off, dry it by hand, and you will extend the life of this. Well, it'll last forever if you take care of it. Even with my German knives with the full stainless steel blade that are much more forgiving when it comes to maintenance, I just get in the habit of taking care of all of them equally so that I don't drop the ball when it comes to my Japanese or Chinese knives. Next up, we're gonna push chop a bell pepper. I'm using the Sugimoto, which is out of Tokyo, Japan. So this would be considered a Chuka Bocho, since it is a Chinese kitchen knife, which is the translation of Chuka Bocho. This is the first maker of this style of knife that was inspired by the original Chinese cleaver. Now, when it comes to the thinness of this blade compared to even this one, this is even thinner. So this is really, really great for push chopping because it just glides through the product. As you can see there, it's kind of effortless. So basically a push chop is where you're coming on an angle to slice forward at the very end when you meet the product. Now with the same knife, you could easily turn these into small to medium dice pieces, say for a salad or anything really. You know, you would think that a blade that's this big wouldn't be capable of these more finer knife cuts, but they do the trick. It's an absolutely amazing knife. If anything, what's great about them is that the weight that you do get from these cleavers, whether it's a Chinese cleaver or an actual meat cleaver, is they make your flow a little bit easier. Yes, there's more weight in your hand, but you don't have to put as much pressure. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. It's a great, great knife. Now let's say you have product stuck on your hand like this. You can use the front flat tip of the knife to push it right off. Now if it makes you uncomfortable doing this and sliding your hand up towards the edge, you'll be fine as long as you're keeping the edge flush to the cutting board. But if you don't want to do that, then get yourself a bench scraper. Since I've got it dirty, why don't we just slice the tomato as well? It's just effortless. Glides right through. And as you're going into a product, once you're in, you would think that you might like tip one way or another, but this higher blade basically keeps your knife cuts much straighter up and down. A lot of people, including myself, tend to kind of get a little bit of an angle, generally aiming in the direction that's opposite of their dominant hand, but this just helps keep you nice and tall and straight. Next up, we're going to do the rock chop on some green onion or scallions. The rock chop is where the tip of the knife stays on the cutting board the entire time. You do not lift it. Instead, what you do is you kind of do this rocking, rolling, pushing, locomotive type of motion where you're pulling up, pressing down, and just create that type of circle. Now, as I'm doing this, I want you to pay attention the best we can with this top camera here to how I am moving my fingers ever so slightly going back along the green onions. My thumb is going to be to the side or to the back part of the product here. You won't see any of my fingertips this way. They're going to be down this way using the front of my fingers here as the guide. Wherever this goes, the knife will go. The other reason I'm doing the rock chop with this Enso is it has a really nice curve to the back of the heel as well as the front of the tip. It's just perfect for that rock chop. And this is where my fingers start gradually crawling back. Now, if you need to regroup, it's totally fine. Get everything bunched back together again with a tighter squeeze, and there you go. This is also where you could get into a push chop. And since these are different lengths and thicknesses, they're going to move around a little bit on you. So just keep gathering as needed. Now let's use the Sentan here to do a variety of different techniques. So you've got basically a push right there. And now we're going to slice these into a quarter. Notice how I'm moving my workflow. I have product that needs to be cut, product that is cut, and now if I have to keep working on it, I'm gonna come back. So what we're gonna do here now is essentially fillet out the seeds of the cucumber. Doesn't have to be 100%, but this first part here that's really wet can make your salad soggy. If you're doing a cucumber salad, that can get really soggy. And now you get to see this pretty large knife being used in a more intricate way. Let's do a couple of these with a push chop, larger chunks for a salad. Now let's do the tap chop with this heavier Sugimoto, and you can see how when you have a product unlike the onion that is lower to the cutting board, this heavier blade can get a lot of good movement. Wow, that was awesome. This is a pretty nimble knife when you're not pulling it 2 inches off the cutting board. Let's do 2 at a time here. Love it. Absolutely love it. Okay, let's crush some garlic. We're going to use the Wusthof here. This wide blade is excellent for smashing garlic. Don't be afraid to use a little force with these Chinese cleavers, but nowhere near as much as you would with a meat cleaver. And last but not least, for the Chinese cleaver, we are going to mince a bunch of cilantro. Actually, 2 bunches of cilantro. Any of these knives will do fine when it comes to mincing or doing the cross chop, which is where you pinch the base of the blade and you pinch the very tip of the spine, and you basically just either seesaw back and forth while ever so slightly moving forward, or you pivot. One thing when it comes to Japanese knives with a very fine sharpened edge, they do not like to be twisted or torqued in any way whatsoever. So when you are mincing, you got to be careful that you're not tweaking the blade in odd positions. Now, to get started, this is very high off the cutting board. I'm not going to start going like this. So instead, I'm just going to do a very rough cross chop. And you can see how that has already reduced its height by half. Actually, more than half. Then what you can do is bring everything together. Do it again. Whew, smells amazing. Pick up a little bit of speed. And once your product is, a 1/2 inch to 1 inch or so off the cutting board, that's when you can start going into your mince or cross chop. Notice how I lifted back up and I pivoted there. I didn't drag the knife. Bring everything back together. Little bouncy here, just gonna have to deal with it. If you get dizzy, just, I don't know, give me a couple minutes. Okay, for the sake of time and the life of my forearms for the rest of the day, I'm gonna stop here. This is considered a rough chop, not a mince, but you know what? I haven't minced something down to the nitty-gritty since culinary school, so for the most part, this type of rough chop will do just fine for the majority of recipes that call for cilantro. Okay, it's time for the meat cleaver, which is also just called a cleaver. Compared to a Chinese cleaver, a meat cleaver has a much thicker spine with a more robust blade that generally tapers much closer to the edge where it is sharpened. Speaking of the edge, it's also sharpened at a much wider angle and is intentionally not nearly as sharp as the Chinese cleaver or pretty much any other knife that you'll find in a kitchen. Many meat cleavers have a full tang handle, meaning that the metal of the blade extends all the way down to the butt of the knife, and then the grip is built around it, which is very similar to this Wusthof Chinese cleaver. But for the meat cleavers, this is generally the style that you're going to see. Most meat cleavers are going to have a pretty standard finish, generally stainless steel or something like this, since they are intended for a much more forceful and aggressive use. If you were to buy a Damascus steel cleaver and you're gonna spend a fortune, it's basically more for looks than it would be for functionality, because that hard steel, even if it's sharpened at a wider angle, is still potentially going to chip or crack, especially if you hit a really hard bone. Now, the weight of a meat cleaver is usually significantly heavier than a Chinese cleaver as well, since the blade is so much thicker and robust. Even if their length is the same, that thickness in metal is going to be a game changer when it comes to weight. This more Western style meat cleaver that I have here is almost 2 pounds. It's actually 1 pound and 14 ounces. Meanwhile, this smaller Wusthof meat cleaver is nearly half that weight at 15.5 ounces. Now for butchers or meat-focused restaurants that break down larger cuts of meat every day, this heavy cleaver may be a bit more useful. But for most home cooks and even chefs in commercial kitchens, this smaller Wusthof, which is significantly lighter, can accomplish the majority of tasks for when a meat cleaver is needed. Now, before I put these cleavers to work, I want to give you a quick tip. Whenever you're using a meat cleaver, you can do some damage to your cutting board because of the amount of force that you're using. So I would recommend either using the back side of your cutting board. This is what I normally use. This is the back side, or have a completely separate cutting board. That way you don't end up having the gashes and even splinters sometimes if you hit too hard, like I do in the back of mine. So the first thing we're going to do with the meat cleaver here is pretty simple. We're just going to cut some chicken thigh bones right in half. Now, whenever I get chicken thighs, I get them bone in and skin on because I render the fat out of the skin, and then I take the bones, I freeze them until I have enough built up, and I like to make stock or broth because there's a bit of meat on these as well. Now for these chicken bones, you got to give yourself a little bit of force, a little bit of leverage, but you just come right on down and you can hack them in half. And I do this because when I'm making stock or broth, I'm going to get more nutrients and gelatin extracted out of that bone since it is cut in half and exposed. Now, when it comes to these more medium-sized bones like these pork ribs here, neither one of these knives are ideal for just hacking at them by themselves regardless of the weight. Couple things you got to consider here is if you are trying to cut through this bone, the first thing you're going to have to do is get a lot of force, a lot of leverage, which means your axe here is going to be coming way up in the air, and that is just simply unsafe. Just very, very unsafe. The next thing you're going to do, as I explained earlier, is put some massive divots into your cutting board. Even if it's an exclusive cutting board for this, you're just going to deteriorate it. So don't do that. The next thing is, I mean, unless you're an axe expert, the chances of you hitting the spot you need to coming back like this, it's pretty rare. So you're going to lose a lot of precision, and that's something you want, especially when you are trying to make riblets out of, say, these St. Louis style pork ribs. So this weekend, I'm going to smoke these, but I want to do it as an appetizer. So we're going to cut these lengthwise, which normally you would have to ask the butcher to do if they'll even do it with a saw. So now with a simple little Wusthof meat cleaver, you can do this on your own, and all you need is a rubber or a wooden mallet. So what we're going to do is position the blade exactly where we want it, and we're going to go right on down the ribs. Now towards the end here, this is primarily meat, so this will be even easier. And any spot you missed, just kind of go back through, give it a little slice. Oop. And see how dull that is? I'm just trying to get through some of the connective tissue and the fat. Like I said, these are not meant to be sharp knives. You could still cut yourself on it, but when it comes to trying to just slice something like that, it's just not what it's intended for. And as you can see, these ribs are cut right through. Now something, just a little heads up, a lot of times it's gonna fall off while you are smoking them, but if you feel around, make sure there's no loose bone because no one wants to swallow that. If you're really concerned, honestly, you could give these a quick rinse under the sink, pat them dry with a paper towel, and you'll be good to go. Now, some of you might be a little concerned because you saw me go from chicken to pork, and now I'm going back to chicken. Well, here's the deal. Don't be concerned because all of these are going to reach 165 degrees. All right, let's wrap things up with some chicken thighs here that we're gonna slice with the Sugimoto. There's two ways you can do this. The first would be a slice, almost like a push chop slice forward motion, or using the tip in a backwards motion. So let's start with the tip first. And the reason that I'm using more of the tip of the blade is you'll notice that the chicken is not sticking all over the side of the knife. And when it does, just like that, it quickly comes off with the next slice. Now we will do more of that pushing forward slicing action. And you can see the chicken will kind of start to develop up on the side of the blade there a little bit more so than the pulling with the tip type of technique. Personally, I rather do it with the tip. But you got to do what's comfortable for you. There you have it. Stir fry or salad chicken, ready to rock with the Chinese cleaver. So when you're looking for a knife with a large rectangular blade, the first thing you need to consider is how you want to use it. Now, let's say you want a knife that's an excellent alternative to the more traditional German chef's knife or Japanese Sugimoto, then a knife with the large rectangular blade, regardless of its name, that has a fine edge and a normal looking spine will basically be perfect for what you need, and that is the Chinese cleaver. However, if you're looking for a cleaver that's designed to hack through bones, frozen food, tough vegetables like squash, then you need to make sure that you have a blade that has a much thicker spine and a more blunted edge that cannot be easily damaged. Now, a quick tip to identify meat cleavers would be to look for this hole at the top of the spine here. Basically, this gives you a nice little hole that you can hang this on a hook or a nail in your shop. And we kind of joke around and say, like, these are meant for your garage, not your kitchen, but I use these in my kitchen quite a bit, as you can see. All right, folks, after seeing me julienne an onion and tap chop with a Chinese cleaver, and then literally pound through some rib bones with a rubber mallet with a meat cleaver, I feel pretty confident that you understand the differences between these two types of cleavers. I'm Chef Brandon with Cutlery and More. Thanks for tuning in.